the dopamine reward system in an ADHD brain does not function the same way. And so what we see clinically is that the dopamine output and therefore the feeling of satisfaction is diminished. Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for coming back if you've been here before, or hi, welcome if you're new. My name is Mickey. I'm a therapist and we talk about therapeutic things on this channel. Today we're talking about parenting an ADHD child. I get a lot of questions about parenting advice generally, but we also talk a lot about ADHD on this channel. For those of you who don't know, I have wicked ADHD. It's also a special interest of mine. So we are talking about parenting advice for ADHD children today. I have a couple of tips for you. This is far from an exhaustive list. There are lots and lots of things. There's also lots and lots of I would say good advice about ADHD parenting. We're going to cover some stuff that I think is important, like foundational material and all of that stuff. But again, not an exhaustive list, also meant to be educational and not therapeutic. If you want a therapist, there's always a link in my description to do that. But if you want more advice about this, let me know in the comments and I can make another video about it. But for today, let's hop into my advice for parenting an ADHD child. Okay, the first thing that I want to talk to you about is kind of a level setting expectation, which is that ADHD is a disability, but it's not a burden, right? This is an important perspective shift for us to make because parenting an ADHD child can be overwhelming. It can be frustrating. We're going to talk more about that in a second. But I do want to encourage people to remember that while there are lots of different interventions and accommodations that we can provide an ADHD child, we're not trying to cure them, right? They don't have a problem or a disease that needs to be cured. They're not broken. They're perfectly good the way that they are, honestly. And personally, I think ADHD makes a person kind of fun and magical sometimes. Neurodivergency is a thing that we should celebrate. And again, while there are going to be deficits in regards to our ability to function for specific aspects of our lives, especially around things like work and school and things like that again, we can provide accommodations around. These are not things that are inherently bad or wrong. It's also important to have this perspective shift in place because ADHD kids struggle, first of all, with being, stigmatized and treated like shit a lot of times. Again, we're going to talk more about systemic issues regarding neurodivergency later, but there's also a pretty common phenomenon with ADHD people called rejection sensitivity dysphoria, which can make folks with ADHD particularly sensitive to criticism, feedback, judgment, and that can be very damaging and very shame-inducing as a child. It's important to remember that as a parent, it's the job to guide and to steer in a direction, but ultimately, especially in these really early and formative years, a lot of a child's sense of self-esteem and their sense of self-efficacy is formed by the way that they're treated by those closest to them, their family of origin, their primary caregivers, those kinds of things. And so the work in being a validating and safe parent for an ADHD child is in celebrating their neurodivergency. Again, obviously we need to provide accommodations when it's necessary and all of that. Again, especially in regards to a child's ability to advocate for themselves, both now and later in life, to feel good and to feel at home in themselves. It's really, really important that we address and acknowledge that ADHD is not a burden. It's not something that's broken about your child. Again, they're perfectly good the way that they are. Okay, before we talk more about that, I want to talk to you about this week's sponsor, which is Earth Breeze. I'm so excited to work with Earth Breeze again because I've talked about this before. Earth Breeze is a liquidless laundry detergent. These little sheets are so fun. They look like dryer sheets, but it's actually just ultra concentrated laundry detergent that, first of all, is really fun because you get to rip it up when you put it in the washing machine, but also is super convenient. So let me talk to you about Earth Breeze. Y'all might not know this actually, but I do in fact have quite sensitive skin. So I'm pretty particular about laundry detergents. And one thing that I really love about Earth Breeze is that, first of all, it's dermatologist tested, it's hypoallergenic, but it also doesn't have bleach or dyes or parabens. And they also have a fragrance-free option on their website, though I do really love the smell of the scented one. I also love how convenient Earth Breeze is because, first of all, I don't have to pick up a big heavy jug, which is genuinely kind of a struggle for me. But it also can be delivered via carbon offset shipping right to your door for free. Listen, if I don't have to go to the grocery store to get something, I'm not going to go. And I love that it gets delivered to my door because while I unfortunately will never run out of laundry to do, I will also never run out of Earth Breeze. I also recently learned that up to 500 million individual plastic detergent containers end up in landfills every year, which was very jarring to me. So I really love that Earth Breeze comes in paper packaging, actually the paper packaging this, but also the paper envelope that they send it to you are both paper. And also I just feel better about being able to use a product that's not adding unnecessary single-use plastic into the world. I obviously am a big fan of Earth Breeze and I think that you will be too. So go click that link in the description, go to earthbreeze.com/Mickey. You can get started with 40% off of Earth Breeze Eco Sheets. If you decide to go back to your old stuff, by the way, you can also get a full refund, no questions asked. So go click that link, show Earth Breeze some love for showing me some love. Thank you again to Earth Breeze for sponsoring this week's video. Let's go ahead and hop back in. Okay, the second thing I want to talk to to you about in terms of ADHD parenting is that sometimes people with ADHD can't help it. And I know that obviously there are valid emotions that people are going to have about folks with ADHD being impulsive or hyperactive or struggling with focus and attention, things like that. That's very normal. That's very human. That's not what we're talking about. But the perspective shift that I want to encourage people to make here is that being a good parent doesn't mean you're being permissive or boundaryless. And ADHD is an interest-driven nervous system. And so sometimes through the way that like our very brains are physiologically structured, we can't help but lose focus, be hyperactive, be like kind of a wild card sometimes, right? Again, it's not that ADHD or parents of ADHD children aren't allowed to have emotions or feelings about this. And I want to encourage people to remember that that frustration that you're feeling is also oftentimes much more a reflection of the way that our world is not structured to be accessible and affirming of neurodivergent folks than it is about your child or their behavior specifically, right? If the world that we live in was more accommodating and accessible and accepting of neurodivergent folks, there would be a lot less of an issue systemically in being able to effectively meet your child's needs and for your child to be able to like function in a way that actually works for them, right? Your enemy is not your child, nor is it their ADHD. It's the way that our world is structured that makes it really difficult for ADHD and neurodivergent folks generally really to engage with the world around us. Along with that, it will mean that we'll have to make perspective shifts about the way that folks with ADHD do things, right? While a neurotypical person might be able to follow a linear train of thought and like buckle down to meet deadlines and to like work diligently on a project until it's finished, that's not a realistic expectation for especially children with ADHD, not just because of the ADHD, but also because children lack impulse control, right? So, well, not entirely, but it's difficult for children. Impulse control is a skill that we develop gradually over time into adulthood. And so there are multiple things that are kind of coalescing here to mean that it is not really a realistic expectation for especially a young child with ADHD to work in the way that a neurotypical person will work. That will mean that we collaboratively, ideally, need to be discussing, figuring out what our accommodations look like, how we can meet what are like, you know, for a lot of people, non-negotiable deadlines about like schoolwork and things like that, while also not foisting this expectation or this judgment about like you should be able to do things in a neurotypical way, because again, that's just not a reality. The third tip that I have for you, that's not a perspective shift, this is actual real advice about how to help your ADHD child, which is that accommodations are external, not internal, right? There is a lot of chatter about ADHD, especially in the like less affirming parts of the internet about like behavior training and things like that. And the thing that I want to encourage you to remember is that first of all, accommodations are environment specific, but also that accommodations are meant to be external rather than internal. What we know about the ADHD brain is that your prefrontal cortex, the fancy therapy word is hypofunctions, but basically it's not a reliable expectation for a person with ADHD to engage their prefrontal cortex to like involve the other structures in the brain in decision making, in like linear thought processes, for example, in the way that neurotypical people do. So what this means is that while I think for a lot of folks, the ideal expectation is that we could just like, you know, bingo bongo our way into ADHD kids being able to do that. Again, that's not a reality. And so what that means is that we need to structure our environments to be accommodating and accessible for folks with ADHD. This is why I said also that accommodations are environment specific, because what somebody needs to ideally function at school is not going to be the same as what they need at home or what they need at like daycare or what they need at an extracurricular activity. All of those environments are vastly different. Again, it's also important to level set here that ADHD is an interest-driven nervous system. So while a child might be more engaged with like a hobby or a sport or something that's a special interest, especially, they might struggle to be engaged, to be attentive, to be focused for something that is not actually very interesting. So we ideally, again, in a collaborative way, in a creative way, in a curious way, want to be having a continual and evolving conversation about what accommodations look like in this environment specifically, and also today specifically, right? This is another thing about ADHD that, like, I can assure you as an ADHD adult is still very frustrating for me too, is that we can't necessarily band-aid something or fix something reliably forever, right? The system that I've implemented to clean my house reliably now probably won't work for me in 2 months because my brain will get bored of it because I'll decide it doesn't make sense because my environment will no longer suit that system. So we're reinventing the system again, which as an ADHD parent, again, you're allowed to feel overwhelmed. You're allowed to feel frustrated about the fact that we're kind of like continually evolving this. And it's really important to be celebrating when an accommodation works for our child, when that environment is maximizing their ability to feel safe and comfortable and ability to meet the, again, like sometimes non-negotiable needs that are, just part of our lives. But again, part of that is going to be a creativity and a collaborative conversation, depending on how old your kid is, obviously. There are a couple of things that I want to talk to you about in terms of like concrete intervention. So I have a list for you. The first one I think is fairly obvious, removing distractions at a time that's appropriate, like especially over short times, right? For me as an ADHD adult, this looks like when I have paperwork or especially busy work that I know I'm going to struggle to focus on, that I have one browser tab open at a time, that I don't have extra pens and like a wrist rest and fidget toys and other stuff on my desk. There is very little stimulus for my brain to engage with other than the thing that I need to be doing. But this can also look like setting realistic limits about our executive functioning times. For what it's worth, for neurotypical folks, what we know from the research is that our ability to engage with like executive functioning heavy tasks, the time limit for that is about 90 minutes. After 90 minutes, your brain out to lunch. It's really, really not a realistic expectation for even neurotypical adults to be sitting and consistently engaging in a really high level critical thinking way with a particular topic for more than 90 minutes. And for neurodivergent ADHD folks, the time limit is even less. And especially for children, it's probably less than that. Set realistic time limits around how often or how long we're expecting a child to engage with a critical thinking heavy activity and take breaks, right? The other thing that I want to talk to you about is that the dopamine reward system in the ADHD brain doesn't work the way that it does in neurotypical brains. While something might feel very rewarding for a neurotypical child, like for example, finishing a homework assignment, the dopamine reward system in an ADHD brain does not function the same way. And so what we see clinically is that the dopamine output and therefore the feeling of satisfaction is diminished. So while something might feel like a mountaintop moment to a neurotypical person, it can feel decidedly mundane and also kind of a fucking letdown sometimes when we've finished something that, like, again, typically would have that dopamine output. So creating a reward system that is consistent, that's reliable, that also honors the interests and things that are actually dopamine inducing for that particular person is a great way to create this system where we're limiting the amount of time that you're required to be engaging with high level critical thinking, and then reward system. A little bit of critical thinking, reward system. This like divvying up of time into blocks is a really reliable tool for ADHD adults also, for what it's worth. But this can create a much more accessible environment for your child to engage with things like homework assignments, like chores, again, the other non-negotiable things that people just have to do. But structuring it in this way is a much more honoring and affirming way to still be realistic and clear, right? That like there are boundaries, there are rules, there are things that have to get done. Being an affirming parent of an ADHD child doesn't mean that you say like, well, you have ADHD, you don't have to do your homework. Like, that's not true. That's not true. That's also not going to set your child up for success. So being clear about like, listen, the world that we live in has limitations. These are things that need to get done, right? You need to brush your teeth. You need to help us with chores, whatever. And we're going to structure that in a way that makes sense, that's affirming, that doesn't require the ADHD child to do things that just aren't intuitive for their brain. Okay, some other tips that I have for you in terms of like practical interventions are setting time limits also. It's very common for folks with ADHD to struggle with their sense of time. We can completely lose track of time and like come up for air hours later, having accidentally toiled on a thing, not being really aware of what we're doing. So setting external timers, there are like tools that you can use, but even just like a kitchen egg timer, a timer on your phone, timer on Alexa, whatever, again, for shorter amounts of time than you probably would think, can be helpful to create check-in points, but also to create, again, those logical breaks. I also want to encourage you to incorporate external reinforcement. We talked about this a little bit already, but again, the internal sense of satisfaction is a little bit wonk. With an ADHD brain, it's not quite the same dopamine reward system. So external reinforcement, like sticker charts, like, monthly, quarterly fun events, or, whatever, like external reward systems. I think that's like pretty well understood, especially as far as parenting is concerned. Also keeping in mind that Lots of competing information is very overwhelming for an ADHD brain. So this can mean limiting the amount of information that we're doling out at one time, especially for ADHD children. When we do the thing where we tell them, when you get home from school, you need to clean your room, take out the trash, feed the dogs, and vacuum the carpets. What's going to happen is that brain will hear one of those things and then either forget the other ones, be overwhelmed and completely shut down and not be able to do any of the things, or that we'll like do something that's not those things because we get distracted. So for an optimal external accommodation, this will look like saying, okay, now that you're home from school, I need you to take the trash out. Take the trash out. And again, reward system. Even if that reward is just like, thanks, that's great. Like, I'm glad you did that. I need you to do three more things. The first thing is that I need you to go do this. Excellent reward system. Go do the third thing, reward system. This breaking stuff down, again, first of all, creates logical check-in points where you're continuing to engage and to help harness the focus, but also creates a much more realistic expectation that's not overwhelming, that's much less likely to result in a breakdown or an overwhelm or like a meltdown, and also helps us, again, to mitigate the amount of time that we have to get distracted. The fourth thing that I want to talk to you about is a phenomenon called restraint collapse. This is something that has gotten a little bit more attention recently that I'm excited to see clinicians and parents alike discussing, which is a question that a lot of parents of neurodivergent folks have, which is, why does my child melt down when they get home from school, from daycare, from preschool, whatever? First of all, it's important to acknowledge that, like, universally across the board, children will express their emotions more readily and more apparently with adults that they trust and feel safe with. So while it sucks to be on the receiving end of like tantrums and meltdowns, it is also a sign of the bond there. And it's, I think, helpful to reframe that. However, for neurodivergent individuals specifically, this will often look like at the end of a long school day, at the end of like a work day, even for ADHD adults, after having repressed all of these ADHD behaviors or impulses that feel intuitive, there's usually like a systems breakdown or like a full meltdown that happens. Essentially what this means is that, like, for example, at school, where fidgeting and hyperactivity, a lack of focus, a lack of like verbal outbursts, interrupting, all of those things that is like very intuitive for the ADHD brain. When we repress that all day long and we finally get home to a place where we feel safe with an adult that we feel safe and validated by, this stuff's going to come out, right? It's going to come out sometimes in an explosive way. However, that doesn't mean that we're just like doomed to deal with meltdowns for the rest of our lives. Building in time that is designed to provide an opportunity to meet sensory needs, to provide an outlet, can be a great resource in helping to mitigate restraint collapse. This might look like the routine being that, like, when we get home from school, we have brain off time, right? Where we have 20 minutes of time where you're, doing whatever it is that your child is interested in. Again, being an effective parent doesn't mean being boundaryless. That doesn't mean you're just saying like, do whatever you want, but like finding a structure, whatever works for your specific family unit, and creating an environment where it's okay and it's safe and it's like encouraged for your child to meet their sensory needs, to have that moment to kind of decompress, right? Where there are very few expectations, depending on what the sensory overwhelms are for an ADHD child, practicing removing those expectations from their environment. And again, just creating this kind of part of a routine that allows people to transition from one environment with a set of expectations that can be pretty strict and rigid to a different environment with ideally slightly more relaxed expectations that are more flexible and more creative depending on what the child needs. The other thing I want to encourage here is to host conversations about this, right? As children age and become obviously like more self-aware of themselves, there will be a greater understanding of what they need, what feels affirming, what feels helpful. Host conversations around this, right? Especially for ADHD kids, there's not really a discourse popularly in school and like other places to be doing this introspection about like, what are my unique and specific needs? What are the things that help my brain to feel better that I need from a sensory perspective? What are the things that are like a sensory ick or that are really overwhelming for me? What are the things that are, helpful, not helpful, all of those things? Encourage these conversations, be genuinely curious about these conversations, and positively reinforce your child for being curious and being vocal about that. What we know about parents who encourage and affirm their children being vocal about their needs in childhood is that it's correlated with an increased ability to advocate for yourself, to promote your own safety, to set effective boundaries as an adult, and also to improve your sense of self-efficacy, right? All of these are very important skills for adults to possess, and something as simple as asking your child to think a little bit or to have a conversation with you about what they need, about what feels good, about what's helpful to them can help to promote that skill later in life. The last tip that I have for you is a little bit of a cliche, but I do think it's important, which is to take care of yourself. I think this is advice that is pretty commonly repeated in the parenting sphere, but I wanted to include it in this video because especially being a parent to a child that can be dysregulated, that can have emotional outbursts, that can be difficult, especially from the neurotypical perspective, to understand. It is very overwhelming, right? It's an overwhelming and sometimes really emotionally charged thing. And the advice of you can't pour from an empty cup, again, it's a very commonly repeated cliche, but I think it's a cliche for a reason. It's important, especially knowing what we know about how many competing expectations and pulls on people's time that there are now more than ever. It is so critical to be realistic about what your capabilities are. This will also mean that you're much more able to be a patient parent, a curious parent, a creative and collaborative parent with your child if you're not pouring from an empty cup. It's, I think, shitty that we tell parents that it's not okay or that it's selfish or wrong or bad to need time for yourself or to be relieved about having time to be an adult, right? To have time to communicate and be in company with other adults. This is a part of human needs. We as humans are structured to need community with people that we feel understand us and that value us and our opinions. So please know that being a parent is such a sacred and beautiful and wonderful part of a person's identity. The work and the value in that should not be understated, in my opinion. And you're a person still, right? You're a human being and you need community and time, both for yourself and with your community, to be a person and to feel fulfilled, to have hobbies, to have interests, to have conversations that are enriching and uplifting and stimulating and fun for you. And that doesn't make you selfish. That doesn't make you a bad parent. That doesn't mean that you don't care about your kids. Again, I think it's also important to level set that in the world that we live in, our expectations about capitalist productivity and a focus on being as productive and efficient as possible steals our joy and also limits our ability to do the thing that we know we're supposed to be doing or need to be doing, which is having downtime to just be in company with other people. So practice setting that expectation for yourself. I know that this is not a realistic expectation all the time, but to whatever degree you're able to, do try to create a regular or consistent routine that you're allowed to check out, that you're allowed to be a person, that you're allowed to be on your own, in your own space, whatever that looks like for you, because you deserve that and because you need that and because truly, genuinely, it makes you a better parent to do that. So I know that this is, again, not an exhaustive list and that it will probably bring up some feelings for folks. So let me know if you have thoughts or questions in the comments. I'm happy to chit chat about this in another video if you guys want me to do that. That said, if you like the video, you can subscribe. We make content like this and we also do a fun pop culture moment. So I'd love to have you stay for that. And then you can share the video to help the channel grow and to help each other grow. I'll see you guys next Saturday. Okay, bye.